All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Building Performance in Your Pro Forma. My name is Twyla Neely-Strite, and I'm the Education and Operations Associate at Illinois Green Alliance. Today's program was put on by the Illinois Green Alliance Programs Committee, a volunteer group that coordinates education events covering a wide range of topics throughout the year for the green building industry. The team that organized today's event consists of Dan Mooring, Matheos Aravosis, and Wayne Beals. You've all been muted upon entry, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A function at the bottom, and we'll get those answered at the end. And this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to everyone in a follow-up email. So for those who are unfamiliar, Illinois Green Alliance is a member-driven nonprofit organization that advances green buildings and sustainable communities for all. Our 5-year strategic plan pushes the green building industry to meet or get on the path to net zero. We achieve this work through education events such as panels and building tours, by engaging communities and partnering with organizations across Illinois, and by advocating for new policies and legislation. You can learn more about membership, see upcoming events, and get involved by visiting our website, illinoisgreenalliance.org. You can also view our recorded webinars through our on-demand webinar library, which is on our website under Resources and Events. This webinar is approved through AIA for 1 LU credit and can be logged for 1 LEED AP or Green Associate CE hour. Certificates of completion for both AIA members and non-AIA members are available upon request. To request AIA CE credit or a personalized certificate of completion for architecture license CE reporting purposes, follow the QR code on your screen and complete the linked form. And I'll also put this link in the chat at the end when the speakers are doing Q&A. For those interested in self-reporting CE hours for your LEED AP or LEED Green Associate credentials, we'll be sharing self-reporting instructions and a fillable certificate of completion in our follow-up email to all attendees next week through Eventbrite. And here are today's AIA learning objectives. I also want to take a moment to recognize Illinois Green Alliance's sustaining sponsors who make our work possible. A special thank you to our gold level sponsors, ComEd, USGBC, and Sloan. You can make a commitment to advancing green buildings and communities across the state by visiting our website, illinoisgreenalliance.org/sponsorship today. And now on to the main event. We have a great lineup of speakers for today's program. Molly Eckert is Vice President of POA's Chicago office, where she leads underwriting and transaction structuring. Molly has worked for POA Chicago since 2011 as project manager and senior project manager, and has been involved in new construction of affordable housing and complex rehabilitation efforts across Illinois and Ohio. Trained as an urban planner, Molly also has worked for affordable housing developers in Kansas City and Boston. Kate Gronstal is Vice President of Development Operations for Evergreen Real Estate Group. She has managed many complex affordable housing projects in Illinois and other states. Kate is a licensed civil engineer with a master's in public administration. Kate's affordable housing career started over 8 years ago. She's an expert in innovating financing strategies and co-locating facilities. Tanya Kadakia is founder of Wrought Iron Partners Consulting and Development, a Chicago-based real estate consulting and development firm specializing in affordable housing and community initiatives nationwide. Wrought Iron Partners brings expertise in project development, complex finance, and organizational capacity building to community development-focused real estate developers, foundations, and municipalities. WIP is mission-focused and impact-driven, prioritizing positive social and economic outcomes as integral to projects. After we hear from our speakers, we'll have an audience Q&A led by Tanya. So remember to add your questions to the Q&A function throughout the program so that our speakers can address them at the end. And now I'm going to pass things over to Tanya to get us started.
Can I make a joke about Kate and I crossing our arms in our photos?
That's because they make you.
That we are.
They make you do it.
Like,
mine. The only reason mine isn't like that is because it was a selfie. Okay, yeah. So let's get rolling here. the affordable housing pro forma and green building implementation. So next slide, please. That's the topic of our conversation today. So I think we wanted to start with kind of first things first. How is affordable housing, how is affordable housing financed? So affordable housing in the US, and we use kind of in the industry, we use the term capital A affordable to distinguish it from lowercase a affordable, which would be what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. So capital A affordable is generally referenced to mean with low income housing tax credits and many other grants and subsidies, that is handled through a complex application process, which we'll get into in a moment. But that capital A affordable is accounts for 40% of all the new or newly rehabilitated housing produced in this country every year, which is a lot. I mean, it's a very big program, and it's a program based on, it's been around since 1986, and it is a investment tool that basically focuses on engaging large firms with a lot of tax liability. We'll get into that in a second. It is a federal program which is administered by the states. That means every state is different. So we're going to focus on Illinois because this is the Illinois Green Alliance is putting this on. But every state really is different. And if you work in different states, you will absolutely find that. States have broad authority to create priorities. And so to what Twyla was talking about in her introduction for a second, I want to pull out this point. You know, this conversation is about, it's about overall, but it's also kind of about individual deals. And Twyla was talking about how Illinois Green Alliance, one of their purposes is to influence policy, if I'm paraphrasing that correctly, Twyla. And I would say that the state housing agencies, or the Illinois State Housing Agency, is and the city of Chicago are the two big entities that one would want to look at if one wants to influence policy in terms of how these things, how low-income housing tax credit projects, this 40% of all new or newly rehabbed housing, is implemented. There is a lot of focus on green building, but if you want it to advance, to move forward, to be different, to be better, to bring things to the table, talking to developers maybe isn't where I would go. I would talk to the state and the city. And Kate and Molly will definitely have thoughts on that. But let me get through some of this baseline material and then stick a pin in that if you have a different thought on how you would approach that. As mentioned, our state housing agency is the Illinois Housing Development Authority. Also, the city of Chicago has its own allocation of tax credits. I missed a phrase there, which is one of only 3 cities that has that. So that means that it can influence how tax credits are allocated and dictate really how tax credits are allocated. Next slide, please. So applying for tax credits, so I'm just going to get in the background about how affordable housing is financed and kind of try and bring everybody some information on how developers see this. There's one application round per year, which means that you're queuing this thing up all year. Developers spend at least 6 months working on these applications themselves. And that can be after potentially a very long time queuing up a deal to get it to a point where it's even ready to put in for tax credits, where it's even baked enough to do that. Third-party costs are $30,000 to $40,000 per application for, you have to have a market study, actually also have environmental review, phase 1. There's sometimes some legal involved, definitely some architecture. Actually, as I'm thinking about it, maybe the number is a little bit low here. So these are, non-trivial. And going on to the next slide, please. Only 25 to 30% of projects are actually awarded credits and the necessary related financing. So your hit rates 1 and 3, 1 and 4, sometimes a project just never goes anywhere because it's not a priority for the state, because it's something else was so great that they couldn't award your good project. So there's a lot of risk. There's a lot of risk and not a lot of certainty involved in these deals. So how are the points organized? What does this look like? That's the next part we're going to get into. So typically a project to get awarded low-income housing tax credits, LIHTCs, needs 72 points to win, sometimes better, depending on the year. And sustainability and environmental construction is up to 13 of those points. And what the developer is doing, like the mindset, is you're kind of shopping for points in the deal structure. So the developer has kind of a deal structure concept, but it has to mesh with the state's deal structure or the city's deal structure concept. You can't just be like, I really think that this lot in Logan Square that is 25 by 135 should be a 20-foot tower of low-income housing tax credits. I mean, obviously, there's a zoning problem with that, but also if that's not the city's priority area or the state's priority area, they're not interested in funding that. So it's really a partnership, a dance, frenemy relationship between the developer and either the city or the state. Because unlike commercial development, you're not in nearly as much control. In a commercial development, so long as the zoning works and you don't have opposition from an alder, you could just move something forward. And if it fails, it fails. And if it succeeds, it succeeds. But that's not how this works. Next slide, please. So, sorry, this is a tad blurry, but this is the IDA scoring rubric. And I'm not going to go over this in like immense detail, but I want to give everybody a sense for all of the different categories and all of the different points. So IDA has a lot of priorities. Accessibility, the unit mix. What does the unit mix means? Does it mean 1s, 2s, and 3s bedrooms and studios? Yeah. It also means the affordability mix. Actually, that might be another category, but just saying in general. It also is the income mix. So it's not just all about 60% of area median income, which is the sort of benchmark income level and rent level, that it's about mixing it up. So some are 30%, some are 50, some are 60, some you can get at 80, but then you have to add more 30s. I'm trying to give a flavor for the kind of dance that's done here. And by the way, just also for reference, 60% of area median income in the city of Chicago is roughly, I want to say $64,000-$65,000 for a 4-person household. Thank you for nodding, Molly, because I don't always, I'm like, I know it's somewhere right in there, but.
Crowdsource that. Somebody probably looked that up today.
So that's, again, let's call it $65,000 for a 4-person household. So, think about what that means, right? In terms of, and then the rent can only be, round figures, a third of that amount per year. So at the bottom of this slide, we see sustainability and energy efficiency, the 13 points as mentioned. We'll get into this in detail in a second, and Molly will lead that part. But I just want to point out, we're going to go through all of them first, that there's a basic level, advanced, net zero. So, and then the developer has to decide if the costs to do those extras is going to get them enough points to get them over the hump, but not get penalized for having too expensive of a project. Again, the dance. Next slide. Here are some more of the scoring elements. We have market characteristics, community affordability risk, access to transportation, neighborhood assets. They want projects that are near grocery stores and transit and schools and other things that are, important for people to have, right? They're looking at development team characteristics as well. And they are prioritizing, I believe they're prioritizing Illinoisans, right? Or am I remembering the city of Chicago one all of a sudden? Yeah. And they also will give some priority to minority and women-owned farms. So that's another thing to keep in mind. There are points you can get for being a nonprofit. You can see down here. Next slide. And then financial characteristics of the deal, rental assistance. Yes, 80% is for that's 80% for a family of 4. So we're at 60, which is where the 65,000 comes from. So, and that may have been, Bridget, that may have been additionally informational. So thank you. Rental assistance, are we offering any Section 8 certificates? Hopefully we kind of know what those are. Leveraging of other dollars from, whatever city you're in or housing authority, and then serving the most vulnerable populations. As you can see, this comes to 100 points, but you can't get 100 points because some are mutually exclusive. So really 72, 75, something like that is about where they're going to land. And again, 13 points is green building related and energy efficiency. Next slide, and I think we're, fantastic. Whose project is this? Please talk about it. Is this yours, Molly?
There are 4 projects. There are 4 projects here. I'll start because mine are at the left end. So we have a project in Colorado, which is a larger project, and actually a lot of the newer financial tools for sustainability we have been using in Colorado and have not quite gotten there in Illinois, just because of how Colorado's policy is. So included a photo of that on the left, which includes a very large courtyard, which is also like a green roof. Then I have on the top Encuentro Square, which is an enterprise green communities building with the latest criteria, which we'll highlight in a little bit, that with that you also get the Energy Star credit, and with the new 45L credit, you can utilize that or kind of like, double up on getting something out of that Energy Star certification. Then the bottom is actually one of our previous co-located library facilities. Those used radiant floors, but also one has a radiant ceiling in that project. And then Molly's is very recent.
This is a photo from yesterday. We have a project called City Commons in Garfield Park that is Passive House, will be Passive House certified. And yesterday, the big milestone to get to that point is achieving a full building blower door test with very, very low leakage results. And we passed yesterday. I didn't pass, but the Skender Ashlar team, some folks on our team were there. Eco Achievers was part of that team to help us get that building tested. And it was built, I can talk about that more, but built to a very airtight standard so that we don't need to use a lot of energy to heat and cool it. So we're really excited about that.
All right, next slide then. So now we're going to talk about sources and uses of funds for a second, and then we'll get into the particulars of IDA's green energy scoring. So this is a sample project, as it says, sample project, great name, 74 units. This just gives you an idea of the breakdown of the costs. This is a $48 million project for 74 units. It's done with construction and almost leased up. So it is relatively recent. It has a big land acquisition cost, big for affordable housing. We often get the land for free or certainly less than that, but it was donated. So there's sort of a give and take on that front. Ultimately, we didn't really pay $5 million for the land. And you can see a couple things. There's a big reserve line item. So this industry is developed in a certain very specific kind of way. So there's a lot of reserves, which are, standard. The investors require this. You can see a developer fee of around $2 million, which we're going to talk about in a second. Architecture and engineering is also a pretty big number at $1.7 million there. And this was a new construction. I didn't mention that. Let's flip to the next one. So in this next, we have what the final sources and the sources of funds were. So a very small permanent loan. Why? Because when you get rents at 60% of the area median income, on average and at best, your perm loan is going to be small, as compared to a market rate development. Their perm loan is most of their cost of construction. It's basically a permanent loan and investor equity. Those are your basic sources. Here, we have all of these other sources, and you see the biggest one by far is low-income housing tax credit equity. Then we have home money, something called donations tax credits, the seller note, which is sort of a paper transaction. I should probably have crossed that off.
But it facilitates the donation tax credit in the state of Illinois. So you'll see it on every deal that has donation tax credits.
Yes, absolutely. And then deferred developer fee. So we see a lot of different sources here, but the real point that I want to make with this slide is most of those sources are basically government sources. So sure, you have an investor who buys those tax credits, but without the government providing the tax credits, you don't have anything for them to buy. So this is the low-income housing tax credits. So if you look at this capital stack, the public sources are basically almost $28 million plus almost $9 million plus 2.3 million. That's like $39 million out of $48 million. So I just want to emphasize the amount of public subsidy that goes into these projects. And we have a tiny little permanent loan because it's all about the rents, and we're not charging $3,000 $4,000 a month rents at this property. This property is charging rents from, I think it's 600 to maybe 1,500. And most of that goes to cover operations. So this tiny little bit of amortizing debt is all it can support. Then the other thing I want to note is deferred developer fee. So we saw that this project had $2 million of developer fee, but IDA requires 25% to be deferred. So that means paid from cash flow. And really what that means, this may or may not be an opinion that others share, but really what that means is foregone developer fee. Like otherwise the developer would have received that cash flow anyhow. I know there's little ways we can pick on that in terms of the cash flow waterfall, but to keep it general, the developer gets the cash flow more or less anyhow. And so I think deferred developer fee is simply foregone developer fee. So developer fee was really, I think it was $2 million and now it's 1.3. So if we can flip to the next slide.
I would add to that really quickly, Tanya, that it's not just foregone developer fee. If for some reason the property does not cash flow enough to pay you that fee, you end up paying taxes on phantom income because it was a gift. So there's even more complexity to it of an added risk that deferring fee gives you.
Yeah, 100%. So, and the risks and the issues there are numerous risks and issues that we're not even getting into, but the phantom income one is no small thing.
Yeah.
So a couple things I want to point out then I want to get into on this is IDA drives almost everything about the application process and has numerous guidelines around everything. Maximums for construction costs and operating costs. These are just a couple of examples. Maximum amounts of money that key professionals can make, including the developer, the architect, and the contractor. And what I want to note here, again, the 25% of developer fee must be deferred, foregone in the consensus of the group. But total developer fee is about the same, total including the deferred, is about the same as what the GC makes. And that covers, many years of pre-development expenses. And it covers a lot of projects that just don't even go anywhere. There can be projects that, you spend some time trying to tie up the land, staff time, you spend money trying to tie up the land. and then it doesn't move forward. And that's, you know, $10,000 here, $50,000 there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. So my point is not that we should feel sorry for developers, but I don't think people understand this at all. So that is actually why I'm bringing the couple of these points to light. So on affordable housing, what the developer makes is maybe about the same as what the GC makes. And the GC,
Generally, I would say, Tanya, generally on our projects, we make significantly less than what the GC makes because of where construction costs are right now. And there's a cap on the developer fee as opposed to the cap on the GC fee is a percentage of the construction. So we
yeah,
generally make maybe half
there
of
we go.
what the GC makes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's also it's your cushion and risk. Like if you underwrote wrong, you have cost overruns that goes away. You're not entitled to get.
Yeah, correct. We have to use it to pay for change orders at times or any other shortfalls. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what happens if the GC makes a mistake in terms of their budgeting?
We pay for it out of our developer fee.
Exactly. So all mistakes are paid for out of developer fee pretty much. You know, for example, there was a project that I was involved with that had it was an urban site, so we knew there was probably fill, and they did borings and nothing was hit. So we thought, I guess we thought maybe it was one of those unusual sites where they dug out the stuff. Nope. Once they started to do excavation, they burned through all of the contingency in the first 2 months due to excavation. And then it was new construction, of course, but anything that happened after that came out of developer fee in terms of any little bits around the edges that were misses or changes that need to be made. So, you know, it's just all, you know, all this kinds of big development risk accrues to the developer. And in contrast to market rate projects, in market rate projects, the developer gets a developer fee for kind of their time and energy in doing the project, but then they also will get profit on sale of the property, which is not a thing with affordable housing. So it's just the developer fee is the entire economics of the deal on affordable housing. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, please. Sources of funds. Oh, great. Okay.
This is kind of just a visualization of what you were talking about. And I think just to drive home what an engine the LIHTC financing, low-income housing tax credit financing is. Even on various projects, whether you have a big first mortgage, or no first mortgage in the case of this one's, whether you have 4% low-income housing tax credits and 9%, which we presented the IDA scoring about are competitive. 4% are generally in the state of Illinois available at all times. If you can make a project pencil, you can and put in all the due diligence, you can go forward, which kind of speaks to Jenny's question. The most competitive, the highest level of financing, the most money is reserved for the competitive projects. But in general, if you're doing something or like a rehab, or you can make something pencil with less LIHTC, then you kind of can go in at any time. So I think this entire panel started with like, what are the special sources in affordable housing or for decarbonization, you know, like what is it? I think, you know, there's a lot of like decarbonization sort of money, you know, tagged out there, but I think on a whole, when you look at what it takes to put a project together, it's actually like the energy money, quote unquote, is tiny, right? It's great. I will never turn down any source of money ever, but it's usually a very small drop in the bucket. So for instance, like those are utility funds. This is the project I was talking about yesterday, or just now with the blower door test yesterday. Energy utility funds are 1% of it. The engine is the low income housing tax credits or local financing, in this case, TIF and home and things like that. I think, you know, it just underscores the extent to which these agencies drive this. The engine that gets this done are the typical affordable housing tools. And therefore, the policies that they put in place do drive to decarbonization, and it's working. That scoring that Tanya put up comes from a qualified allocation plan, which tax credit agencies have to put out every year or two. And those are policy documents, and they are influenced by political, you know, pressure. And I think there was a Midwest decarbonization group. I'm not sure if they're affiliated with IGA, but they were like, let's get decarbonization put in these QAPs in the Midwest, and they succeeded. So, I mean, for people that care about these types of projects, that's the kind of advocacy. Those are the kind of tools that get these projects done. So this is just a visualization of the capital stack, the list of sources it takes to get a project done, in a couple recent instances we've used. But the next slide, I think, is
Let's move to the next one because it's a rehab project. But
that's a
it does
rehab.
still kind of show you like the amount that comes from these like sustainability, the decarbonization, greenhouse gas reduction, all energy efficiency. All of that is a very, very tiny percentage of what we're using to fund these projects. Even with new sources becoming available, it still is a sliver of what these projects need to get done.
Yeah, the scoring categories, I laugh because Tanya talked about them being in contrast, right, or competing, because one of them is cost containment, but then the other one is like a net zero project. So you probably can't have both, but it's important. And, we care about equity, we care about good living environments, we care about getting housing built. It's all important. But this is the HUD element. There's a HUD GRRP program for just Section 8 properties. And again, this is the smallest piece of the funding that they have, but even that is that little blue band at the bottom, the ComEd grant, are just very small pieces. The engine here, in this case, is 9% light tech equity. And then the last one is another rehab with just to highlight the GRRP is really meaningful. This is 4% light tech equity. This project is in Cincinnati, but same, there's not a lot of funding. This is a building renovation, a historic building. So you'll see historic tax credits are a big part of that, which in some ways can kind of run counter to sustainability programs. It's hard to find a historic window that's Energy Star related, those types of things, because you have to get all this scarce money together for these public-private projects, which are affordable housing. You often have competing priorities. So you have to figure out how to get historic tax credit equity to work with a decarbonization project. So, but this one is the HUD GRRP program, which was a time-limited recovery money effort of the Biden administration to have HUD green their own housing, which is huge. But it's kind of it's still, to that extent, it's like a pilot type project. We hope it becomes more sustainable, but it takes a lot of money to really decarbonize the existing housing stock. So just an example of what that capital stack looks like.
Next slide. Great. So I guess, Molly, will you keep going with this? So next, the slide after this is gonna show the detailed one of all the different programs here.
Yeah, and I think probably people on this call are can speak a lot more detailed than knowledgeably than I can about the variations between each of these different types of certifications. But as part of those 13 points awarded in the QAP, again, for that very valuable money to really build new buildings, is that you have to be certified according to one of these green standards. But IDA, actually, it's mandatory that anybody coming to them for any kind of money is certified under Enterprise Green Communities, which is good. And it really, leads you to do a lot of things like resident manuals, blower door testing, lead and radon testing, a lot of things you may or may not have to do under different programs, but it's a really good process. Resident charrettes, team charrettes, ongoing compliance, insulation. It's a very good baseline standard. But beyond that, I mean, you are picking things that involve investment, intentionality in the way that you construct a building or put together a rehab. Some of these standards are actually quite difficult to meet in terms of rehab. A lot of the newer versions, I think if you go to the next table, Tanya, on the next slide, IDA's actually, they're giving points for net zero, which is great. I mean, on the track to be fully decarbonized here in the next couple of decades. They're saying, look, if you really want our money, figure out how to do net zero. And those projects are nearly impossible to meet in rehabs, but they're really important. So there's just these are the levels at which you have to achieve certification to get these different point levels. So I would say, I mean, that project that we showed yesterday too is a FIAS, a Passive House Institute project. And it was funded by tax credits from the city of Chicago, not IDA, and several years ago before these standards were implemented. But even that project it's near net zero, but not net zero, right? And we were able to take advantage of zero energy home credits from the Department of Energy and other things like that, but it isn't a pure net zero building. So it's interesting, that standard is higher than I think where anyone is in the market right now. But it's designed as public money to be an incentive. So it'll be interesting to see with this, what happens with this QEP and the next crop of affordable projects in Illinois. I don't know, Kate, if you have anything to add.
I mean, I think the one thing we were going to note on there, and some of that comes to this of like shopping for points, like, and these different things. I think we've discussed before, but we tend to, especially for new construction, we tend to move towards enterprise green communities as the standard we're going with, because that tends to have the most, we feel like produces the most value for the affordable housing project and for the residents, as opposed to some of the other standards like LEED, where we end up kind of chasing points, as opposed to looking holistically at the project and what's going to be best for the residents, and, you know, for ownership of the building.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple questions. Oh yeah, FIAS is there in that bottom row. It wasn't on that slide before. If the 1% of funds, so we think the passive house premium in the building that we built is about 10% when you look at building systems, in terms of over like a baseline project. And I'm sure Kate's looking at stuff right now, trying to figure out what that
No,
premium
I'm
is.
looking at, yeah, I'm looking at that answer. I mean, it's saying you're asking what can that 1% buy you, right? Anything, like anything added? Generally, no.
Sure, you
It's
get your
not getting
development.
you anything extra.
Yeah.
It's making the project happen, but you're generally not able, it's generally not enough money for you to be able to add something that you wouldn't have otherwise done. And part of that is because if you look at these requirements, right, they're pretty intense already to get to scoring, especially if you want to try to hit 10 points. You know, as Molly noted, like hitting 13 points can be really challenging. And so like maybe you're trying to hit 10 points, right? But you're pretty much required to get those base points, of doing enterprise green communities. So that extra percent is not really getting us, much of anything.
But again, like you're never going to turn down money because that's the difference
Well, we
between
need it.
change order, that risk, or anything like that.
Yes, it's the difference between a project getting built and not getting built, right? So that's where it's at. Sometimes it's just what gets it over the finish line, not necessarily that you're getting an added, you know, benefit to the property because of it.
And we can talk about PV too. I think we have a couple bullet points on that later, but there's some great incentives for photovoltaic panels, solar in Illinois, which in concert with this.
Yeah, and those are some of the newer things, which is I think what we're hoping to get into. We can move, Twyla.
So these are really these are just conversational points. Feel free.
Right, and we kind of answered some of that on, you know, like how we're balancing these things. But I think, you know, the design teams are really critical to helping us understand, what's possible, and also how much is that really going to cost, right? A lot of times with certain need to bid out different construction, we really rely on the design team to kind of know what the lay of the land is. I think it's becoming increasingly more important overall, which is why we kind of are pushing on city policy, because the city wants you to competitively bid to GCs. But I think we all feel as an industry like there's that kind of design assist piece that is really beneficial for all of us understanding what's the cost associated with this, how are we going to get there, like how do we look at it holistically and understand what it's going to cost to put some of these things in place.
And I was just gonna, there needs to be an intentionality about it from the beginning. I think like it's not easy because like if you're doing geothermal or something like that, you know, you have to know where you are, you know, that's part of your site selection as part of your, you know, basic kind of layout and things like that. I think one thing we've learned with designing a passive house building is you can't just like wave a wand or check a few boxes. Like it has to be the way the building is set up. Like, is it a pretty square box? Like, we have a passive house building with terraces and cantilevers, and it's just not ideal. And so you just, like, when you're thinking about your site, when you're thinking about your layout, your orientation, your landscaping, do you have enough land to make it net zero, to add solar, things like that? Like, that, all that comes from like the beginning, you know? So these are pretty critical, like Kate said, sort of day one questions about what can you get done here. But yeah, designers are a great partner, and I think they have to be bought in at the beginning and understand, you know, how form follows function in a lot of these types of projects as well. And I like, I know, yeah, so many architects that are so well versed in these checklists, enterprise green communities, all of it, you know, they'll know if this, then that, you know, and so it's just been an awesome resource to us with every project we've done.
This is Dan's metaphor slide of squeezing it for all the juice that we can get out of it. So we can move to the next slide. So a little bit of this is talking about some of the newer resources that are in play. The 45L credit, which I mentioned before, if you have Energy Star certified units, which if you're doing enterprise green communities, you have Energy Star certified units, you have to be able to, pay and like document prevailing wage, which a lot of our projects do, but not everyone is required to do that. It depends on the funding sources. So that may add a lot of extra cost to your project. Depends. But it's $2,500 per unit of like credits, right? So not $2,500, it's credits. Our pricing that we have on a most recent deal for the 45L credits is about 89 cents on the dollar. So, you know, that's where that is. And then a newer thing that has come up for us, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the funds that are within that, as those are being implemented and rolled out, they are telling us that, okay, this also requires Build America, Buy America, or what they're referring to as BABA. And that includes like all of your construction material has to come from the United States. And, you know, the example that I've put here is the project that we're getting those greenhouse reduction funds on is a cross-laminated timber building, not in Illinois, but the cross-laminated timber, the vast majority of it in North America comes from Canada. That is where they have, you know, forests to be able to, you know, do that sustainably. And so that is causing us a challenge with this BABA criteria and trying to figure out a way to still do that and meet that criteria, or if that means we need to forego that money, you know. And we're looking at what are those costs, like how much more is it going to cost to get literally every single thing that goes into the project coming from the United States. And we may not be at a manufacturing point right now where that's possible, and thinking about not only costs, but also lead times, right, for getting things related to that. And then Molly, do you want to talk a little bit about solar? That's you've had that a little bit more on yours.
Yeah, I think we're opposed. I mean, I think there's always been incentives in Illinois for solar, and like, so a lot of the vendors that we've used have been some of the best intermediaries for that, like really educating us, helping us go after solar thermal, like for hot water systems. That was something you saw a lot like 10 years ago. But it's kind of right now in Illinois, especially for affordable housing development, kind of the golden age of photovoltaic solar installation. There's a lot of amazing tools right now that were passed in the State House through like the CJAC, probably through the advocacy of IGA and other folks on this call. But there's just like very deep incentives, rebates for the construction of solar that will benefit public facilities and affordable housing. So it almost like pays for itself in reimbursements, upfront SRECs, things of that nature. And again, I'm probably not speaking as intelligently as I could, but there's always been a federal solar tax credit and ITC, which had kind of softened over the years, like it was sunsetting in terms of rate, and recent Recovery Act legislation ticked that up again. And so that's about a 30% credit for cost. does not count against, I think, your tax credit basis. So those were some powerful shots in the arm that kind of made that tax credit more powerful. And those are real incentives that do pay for solar. And so that they were kind of masked in some of those pie charts I put out because they're purchased by the light tech investor. I mean, that's the good thing is that you have, with that type of project, you have an investment structure. If people are putting out credits, right, they're going to buy your 45L credits. They're going to buy your solar tax credits for a price, which is real equity that pays for those features. Also through additional Recovery Act money, there were adders, right, that they were going to boost that credit if you were in affordable housing. There's also opportunities for community solar. So a lot of people that are building solar, developing those arrays right now are looking to get it paid for by selling subscriptions to affordable housing. So in many of our properties, people's light bills are significantly written down by solar credits, kind of arrays and installations across the state. So it's just a really important resource and is really impacting low-income people, keeping their bills low, getting solar built. So there's a lot to look into there.
And one other thing I want to, well, we can stay on the side, but one other thing I want to note on some of that is like, as different funding sources have become available, right? So to Molly's point, like on the solar, with the Inflation Reduction Act and Recovery Act, those made those tax credits like increase the credit that you were given on that. So it helped make solar more possible, right, at buildings, because those credits had gone down. So, you know, projects you see under construction right now, maybe if they're just starting construction, they might have taken that into account, but it takes a couple years, right, from when that policy change happens, because it takes so long to get these projects from concept to starting construction, that a lot of times it takes a few years for you to see whatever those policy and incentive changes are actually show up in practice, right? And one other thing I want to note is, depending on funding sources, we've had a lot of different things come to us of like, oh, like we, you know, net zero buildings, and here's a foundation that's paying for net zero buildings for these various things. A lot of times, if it's a private, if it's a private entity that is funding those, their requirements make it very difficult to utilize with affordable housing. So that's one thing I did want to note to people. Sometimes they require that it go to a nonprofit or to a government entity, and that it can't pass through that entity to another entity. And because we primarily, as you saw, work with tax credits, our entities have to be taxable entities. So we have had issues in the past where funding sources would come to us and say, hey, we can give you $1 million for a project, but their own criteria prevented affordable housing from accessing those funds. So just a side note. These are kind of the big thing that I think we wanted to hit on today. I know we're like almost at our end, but this is like, I think the really good piece for you guys. There are a lot of different things that we have to take into account when we're doing any kind of sustainability features. And obviously there's obvious things like hard cost. What is the actual cost to construct whatever that is? But then there's a lot of additional things that you may not think about, or even we may not think about until something is put in practice. One that I added literally just at the end, and it really goes to a lot of the all electric and the push for all electric and the push for electric vehicle chargers, is the ability to get sufficient electrical capacity. So we have projects where a project gets put on hold because the grid cannot handle that new development coming to that location, or we see substantial added cost coming in for that. Additionally, it's really critical for design teams to give us those load letters that are very specific really early on, because of the increase in all electric. There is a huge delay in, you know, transformers, switch gears, other equipment. Other things that we want to consider are, you know, what's the administrative burden to get whatever that resource is? Is it worth the amount of time and effort for the amount of money that we're getting? Are there contractors? We usually work with MBE, WBE, Section 3. Are there contractors that are, familiar enough, those contractors familiar enough with that particular system to install it? And then our implications for operations. So is our maintenance staff on a fairly low budget able to manage those systems long term? Or is it too complicated, right, for them to understand? And then the impact on residents. And we hit on one thing I think that Molly and I both agreed on during our planning for this, things like VRF units. They're very efficient. We've stopped using them in as many places as we can, especially with seniors. So there's all kinds of issues that when a resident actually has to use the system, are they able to use the thermostat? Do they understand it? Do they have cold air blowing on them when they're not expecting it? So those are all considerations we really want design teams to be taking into consideration.
There was a question about I think people are still trying to get their arms around BABA, honestly, but I think
Yes.
it becomes industry specific, and you've waded into this a little bit more, Kate, but I think it behooves certain industries to publish this type of water heater is BABA compliant, and so I think you're going to see it a lot more in sort of this type of product complies, this doesn't, or approved lists for energy or education or housing, things like that.
It's very, I don't know if can we share screens on this? Can I share a screen, Twyla? Because I'll just share with you because I have it pulled up just the section from BABA. So this is the section from BABA that talks about construction material standards. So, and it says Buy America preference. It's not much of a preference. It's more of a requirement. We haven't gotten any exceptions to anything yet. Yeah, I can zoom in. Sorry.
There we go.
That's better. Okay. Yeah. So, it's got literally very specific, but there's not, like Molly's saying, it's not like there's a list right now of here's what's acceptable, but it's down to this: all manufacturing processes from initial smelting or melting through final shaping, coating, and assembly occur in the United States, right? So it's down to the very detail of as soon as we might not have the raw material in the United States, but everything else has to happen here. And so they've gotten into very specific requirements. We've yet to we're just diving into this right now. It's brand new. But this has become a challenge for us on that current project, especially related to the lumber, because it's even from initial debarking. So even just taking the bark off of the wood has to occur in the United States. So it's a little challenging, but yeah, there's definitely not a comprehensive list.
There's a question from Alina about how teams creatively addressing IDA's price cap per square foot while also meeting stringent sustainability criteria. Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to what I was kind of thinking about is your building best designed to achieve this, right? Is it a box? Is it oriented this way? I think there's a lot of just trying to go back to the fundamentals of it and see, and what can you forgo? I mean, in terms of other finishes, or what can you you can prioritize green versus maybe fancy amenity spaces, or a certain type of siding or building finish. I think those trade-offs are what we're always looking at.
And I do think that the point that Tanya made earlier of there's scoring that if you don't, if you're doing this sustainability, you're not going to meet the cost control, the cost containment. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to get both points. And a lot of times we do go over the price cap on various projects for a variety of reasons. And then we have to provide an explanation as to why we're doing that. And they are going to want us to push back and say, okay, what else can you take out of this project in order to get to that cost? But I do think there's definitely the need for more advocacy for that to catch up to those price caps, to catch up to the reality of the current construction market, but also the reality of the sustainability requirements that are being requested. And so I would say for Illinois Green Alliance, for all of our people that are on this call, that's an advocacy area that I think is much needed, because if we're going to be held to that standard, we need to have the cost caps reflect that.
I would also note that this is sort of related, but in terms of just piggybacking off of advocacy, because I just want to get this in before we hit 1 o'clock, and I can stay a couple minutes, but is a lot of what green items can be incorporated depends on the zoning and the building codes in your area. Building codes really is what I mean to say. And so, for example, reuse of gray water, even in landscaping, is not something that's permitted here. And I haven't worked outside of, I haven't done a development outside of Illinois in a little while. So other states may be doing much better on that, but this is another place where advocacy can be really useful. And Illinois is still terrified of timber, even cross laminated timber. Chicago.
So you're saying it's not an Illinois project.
Yeah. We tried to do one, and it was rejected because they did not want cross laminated timber at the size of building that we were proposing for this project. So, I think that's a huge way of saving water and eliminating waste, is just gray water, even in landscaping. But again, it depends on zoning and building codes.
Whether we can do that.
So please advocate in that direction around.
So we have one other question kind of on expanding on the VRF and why it's been less desirable. So I'll get into a little bit of my thoughts, and Molly then can add on. But what we've seen is the installers that we have not traditionally, right, over the course of the last 5 years, fully understood VRF or had sufficient training. And again, some of that goes back to the fact that a lot of times we're using a smaller firm, an MBE firm. So we definitely had issues where the construction was not done correctly. And we did not, on one building, we didn't find out for 2 years. We just had heating and cooling problems for 2 years. And it took the third consultant that we brought in. And finally, we were able to get the manufacturer's rep to come out, and they realized that it was piped incorrectly. But it went through inspections from everyone, from the MEP engineer, from the city, the sales rep came out, we had 3 different maintenance contracts, but the complexity of the systems and it not being the traditional way things are installed, a lot of things are reversed on VRF compared to how they are with a more traditional system. So there's that issue. There's the issue that our maintenance staff do not understand the systems. And we're also we're affordable housing, as you saw. It's not just hard cost limits, there's operating cost limits. We have limits on what we're allowed to spend for operating, which then limits what we have for salaries to pay for people. So we can't get someone that is highly educated and can, manage this system. And even the consultants we hire sometimes aren't good with these systems. So that's one piece. Yeah, sorry. The other piece is just residents are confused by these systems. They don't understand how they work.
And I would echo, we don't not use them, but just recognize that there's such a threshold for training for not only our teams, construction, operations, residents require. Because I think that technology is here to stay. It's just not what people are used to.
And sometimes I think for us, everyone wants us to be the early adopter, like affordable housing. And we really struggle with that because we don't have the budgets to be able to get the training and everything else. So while we'd love to be the early adopter, we don't always have the capacity to be the first one who did something.
Well, thank you all for answering all of these audience questions, and thank you, audience, for asking great questions and staying on till the end. We really appreciate it. Kate, Tanya, Molly, thank you again for sharing with our audience, and everyone be on the lookout for a follow-up email that will include a recording of this and also some information about how to report your CE credits. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Right. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks.
You.
Thank you so much.